Okay, hello friends, and welcome to another live stream here Wednesday evening at Empty Cloud Monastery. So I hope that you're all doing well wherever you are. It might not be the evening for you, but I hope that this is a good time to settle down and listen to the teachings from the Buddha for a little while and to focus our minds on something precious, something valuable. So today I thought that I would talk a little bit about a collection of discourses, a collection of poems, actually, mostly poems from the discourses. These are from the collection of teachings we have passed down by the Buddhist tradition that are attributed to the Buddha and his disciples and the people he met. And so this particular collection is something that's very, very old, very ancient, and also one of the most revered collections within the larger collection of discourses that we have. And so I thought I would spend some time talking a little bit about this with all of you, sharing it with you, because it's something that I really enjoy, something that I find very, very valuable. And so we will start by reciting the traditional homage to the Buddha, and just a quick refuge, and then we'll start. And if you have any questions while I'm speaking, feel free to put them into the chat, or the people here in the audience, feel free to ask me after I'm finished speaking, and then we'll address those at the end. So this time I'll pay homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ dhammaṃ saṅghaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi. And so hello to Karuna and hello to John, who are joining in as of now, and all of the other people who are joining in who haven't said anything yet. So as I was saying, I thought that tonight I would share with all of you something that I find really interesting and something that I find really valuable, very beautiful, and that is this collection called the Parayanavagga. So the Parayanavagga means the chapter on the way to the beyond, or the chapter on the way to the far shore. And this is found, currently it's found in a collection called the Sutta Nipata, and within that we have this chapter called the way to the beyond. And so for those of you who are more familiar with the Buddhist texts, you might be immediately familiar with this, but for those of you who aren't, I'll just give you a little bit of an idea so that you can find it in the future. So we have 4 major collections of Buddhist discourses. That's the collection of long discourses, medium length, connected or topic organized, and then the numerical discourses. And apart from those 4 major collections, we have a 5th kind of collection, which is just called the minor discourses. And despite its name, it's actually the longest, and it includes several independent books. So you might have heard of the Dhammapada, or the Udana, or the Itivuttaka, or the Theragatha or Therigatha. So all of those independent books, mostly of poetry, are included in this collection. And one of those books within this is called the Sutta Nipata, which means the collection of suttas, so a very generic name. And that has several chapters. The last 2 chapters are probably the most famous, and they're also considered very old. The one is called the Atthakavagga, and I have spoke about that in the past. And this one is called the Parayanavagga. So like I said, it means the chapter on the way to the beyond. And so part of the reason that this is such a special collection is that it's actually referenced in other suttas. And in fact, it's referenced by the Buddha himself. So it's said that the Buddha in some of the other discourses where he's teaching, he actually recites a verse from this and he talks about it. Or other mendicants, other monks, they recite and discuss verses from this. So this is one of the very rare times where the Buddha actually refers to other teachings and cites them and quotes them in his own teaching. So if we take that at face value, that means that the Buddha himself knew of this collection, or at least of part of it or some of it. He references it by name. He calls it the Parayana. And he also references some of the questions by their name, which are currently also their current name. So this collection is attributed to the Buddha, and we find the Buddha himself referring to it. So that makes it very special, because that's very rare. And so we can tell that the Buddha seemed to like it, and his disciples seemed to like it. And there's also a sutta where a laywoman named Nanda says that she gets up every morning, very, very early, and she recites the Parayanavagga. She recites the chapter, this Parayana. She recites it. So it was also memorized by laywomen, or lay followers in general, but in this case a laywoman. And she herself was a non-returner. So she's one of the most famous lay people in the suttas. She's a kind of chief example of a laywoman, or of any lay follower. Her name was Nanda Mata, actually. So not Nanda, I'm sorry, but Nanda Mata, so mother of Nanda. And ironically, there's actually one of the people in this collection is named Nanda, though I assume that it's unrelated. But it's technically possible that actually she's related to the person, but I highly doubt it. So Nanda Mata, the mother of Nanda, she would get up every morning and recite this. And amongst her other abilities, she was reciting it, and it said that someone who had passed away in her family was reborn as a deva, reborn as a kind of angel or spirit. And he overheard this. And so she dedicated her chanting to him. So this is something that seems that the devas themselves are said to know about. The Buddha himself knew about it. His enlightened lay followers knew about it, as well as his enlightened monk disciples. And so it's really something that's quite special. The other thing that makes this collection special is that it follows a kind of progression. So often we have individual suttas, or we'll have individual poems, but oftentimes they're disjointed, right? So one time the Buddha speaks a particular discourse, he gives a teaching here, he gives another teaching and a different teaching, and they connect to each other in a broad framework. So everything the Buddha teaches, it all kind of connects, but it's not necessarily in a kind of chronological order or in a specific order of teaching. It's more by topic or by number, or just arranged in order to memorize it. But the suttas, the individual suttas in this collection, they all come as one unit. So I'll tell a little bit of the story for this. So the story, the background story to the Parayanavagga, it's actually recorded. At the very beginning of the collection, you have something called the Vaḍḍha, the verses kind of introducing, the introductory verses. And these verses, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but they're not really believed to be very old, at least in relationship to the other poems, because we have an actual text in the Pali Canon called the Niddesa. It's a very early commentary on some suttas, specifically one of them, one collection being the Parayanavagga, which is another sign of how important it was, the fact that we have an actual commentary in the canon, which is older than the main Pali commentaries that most people know. So it has its own special kind of canonical book. But that book doesn't actually comment on the introductory verses. So at the time that it was composed, which was several hundred years after the Buddha, it didn't apparently know, or at least it didn't comment on these. So they maybe were not considered canonical at the time. And they also use some terminology which is from a later period of Buddhism, so it uses some words which are later. But we don't need to dwell on that too much because it's not so important. What's more important is the story, which is just kind of framing the context. So we don't need to take it too literally, but we also shouldn't dismiss it, right? Because stories and narratives, they help to give some life to the teachings. And so it's not certain how much of this is literal, how much of it is more, you could say, imaginative or literary. But either way, the story itself stands. And in this story, we find ourselves meeting a Brahmin named Bhavati. So Bhavati is said to be a Brahmin who is aspiring to nothingness. He's aspiring to have nothing, or to nothing. And so that already makes him kind of interesting, right? So who's this Brahmin who's aspiring to nothingness? And it says that he's living far south. For the time of the Buddha, he was living relatively far south on the banks of the Godavari River. So if any of you know India, you might know this river. And so he's living by this river. And it says that he, like I said, is aspiring to nothingness, and he performs a big sacrifice. So he goes and performs a sacrifice in the village where he's staying, and all of the wealth that's accumulated, all of the donations and the wealth, he distributes them out. So he doesn't keep any of it for himself. And so this is already a kind of sign of his character, of Bhavati's character. He's not looking for money, but he's a spiritual practitioner. And he does this grand sacrifice, distributing the wealth to the village, maybe out of compassion, maybe the people there wanted it, or maybe to help distribute the wealth. It's not exactly clear, but he doesn't do it for his own gain. And so after he does this sacrifice and distributes the wealth everywhere, he goes back to his hermitage. He goes back to where he's practicing. And at a certain point, it says that a very scruffy, dirty Brahmin shows up, and he demands 500 coins. So we don't have a lot of context, but you could imagine Bhavri here has been known to distribute a bunch of wealth. And so this Brahmin shows up, maybe he didn't get any money, and he wants Bhavri to give him some too. And Bhavri very politely invites him and asks how he's doing. And he tells him very calmly and politely that he doesn't have any money. He doesn't have 500 coins, at least, to give to this Brahmin. But the Brahmin is not a spiritual practitioner in the same caliber as Bhavri. And so he says that if Bhavri doesn't give him what he wants, if he doesn't give him the money, then he utters this curse over him. He curses Bhavri, saying that his head in 7 days will split into 7 pieces. And Bhavri is very scared of this. So for some of us, it might not seem so scary, but actually this is a curse that was kind of going around, you could say. It's a curse that people believed in, that people said in the time of the Buddha and around that time. So we find references to this actually in the suttas as well, and in other texts, other Brahminical texts, that Bhavri was part of that tradition. And so this Brahmin essentially curses Bhavri, and he performs a little ritual, and he curses him, and so then he goes away, and Bhavri finds himself in extreme fear. So it says that Bhavri essentially was extremely upset, his mind was very depressed, and he wasn't able to enjoy his meditation. Specifically, it says he wasn't able to enjoy jhana, implying that he was an attainer of jhana, so implying that he was a meditator, right? And so Bhavri is in this kind of dire scenario where in 7 days he thinks his head is going to explode, he's extremely upset, and an angel or a spirit comes, and she tells him that that person who cursed him doesn't know anything about heads or head splitting. But the angel says that there is someone who does know, and that's the Buddha, the conqueror. The Buddha knows. And so Bhavri, he's very interested in this, right? He wants to get rid of this curse, and he says, well, tell me about this. And she says that the Buddha is in Savatthi. So Savatthi was a town far away. And that he should go and he should talk to the Buddha about heads and head splitting, and that's where he'll find his answers. So Bhavri, what he does is he gathers his students. So he was seemingly a meditation teacher in the tradition of maybe the Upanishads. So this is, for those of you who know, it's a kind of very revered Brahminical scriptures, very revered mystical tradition in what is now known as Hinduism, but at the time Hinduism didn't exist. And so he was part of a tradition along those lines, and he gathers up his students and he tells them that they should go and see the Buddha and ask him about this and then report the answers. So long story short, the students, we have 16 of them, 16 students that are students of this spiritual teacher Bhavri, and they go on a journey to meet the Buddha. And finally they get there, they arrive there, they meet the Buddha, and there they start asking these questions. And it said that as they gather there, they're gathered with many, many students. So each one of these people, the 16 disciples of Bhavri, 16 disciples of the Brahmin meditation teacher, they all arrive with their own group of disciples. So they were all themselves teachers. So these are not just ordinary people, they're all advanced, or at least somewhat on the path towards meditation and trying to achieve enlightenment, trying to achieve liberation. And so they go to the Buddha as a spiritual guide. So this is kind of contextualizing a little bit who the Buddha was, right, and how we can imagine the Buddha. So at the time, there were many people who were trying to attain liberation from the cycle of birth and death, trying to achieve liberation from continued repeated existence, samsara, who were meditation masters, who practiced meditation. And the Buddha was one of those people who practiced meditation and who taught how to achieve liberation, and he gathered a reputation for himself. right? And so in this story, it's interesting. How are we supposed to take this, right? How do we relate to it? And part of it is actually very revealing how Buddhism has related to the cultures and the ideas that it finds itself in contact with, right? So we might think that, okay, things like magical spells and incantations, these are things that the Buddha himself discouraged, things that he thought were often just completely misleading, right? But if we look at the story, how does it go? So Bhavri has this situation where he's been cursed. He thinks his head is going to break up into 7 pieces. And this Buddhist figure, this Buddhist spirit appears and kind of reasons with him. So the spirit doesn't say, oh, that curse is silly, but rather the spirit says, that person who uttered the curse, they don't really know what they're talking about. But this other person, he does know, the Buddha does know. And so this is the kind of strategy that Buddhism has taken from the beginning, really. And that's one of accommodating and assimilating, but raising up to a higher spiritual value the ideas that it finds itself in contact with. So for example, the idea of curses and magic. Rather than denying magic, instead, the Buddhist approach is more taking the terminology and the framework of magic and lifting it up to a higher spiritual standard. So what the Buddha says when they finally get there, and the Brahmin students, they ask the Buddha about this, he says that the head is ignorance, and splitting the head is knowledge. What splits the head is knowledge. So again, he doesn't dismiss the curse, but he kind of inverts it, right? Because originally the head is Bhavri's life. But here he turns it into ignorance. And splitting the head here instead is knowledge, because we want to remove ignorance. And so one way of thinking about this is, you can imagine, for example, something like sports, right? So one way of relating to sports is to say, oh, sports are silly. Why would you watch that? It's just a bunch of adults running around playing games. And so that's a kind of dismissive approach, right? But the way that Buddhism has historically approached these things is more like, say that someone plays sports. The Buddhist approach would be to say, well, you know what would be a real champion? What would be a real winner? It would be applying that energy that you apply towards the sports and applying it towards spiritual practice. And a real winner is someone who achieves freedom from the defilements, right? So just kind of a loose example here of how often Buddhism takes terminology and it uses it and raises it up to something higher, so that we're encouraging people to go beyond what they're already at, go beyond the level that they're at. So Bhavri was at this point where he was stuck in the curse, and the Buddha's teachings lifted up to something higher, something spiritual. So don't worry about that curse, worry about the real problem, which is ignorance. Worry about the real problem, which is splitting ignorance, right? So I hope that makes a little bit of sense. I think it's just something that's worth discussing here in this narrative story, because often it might be either taken too literally or taken just completely as to be dismissed. But there's actually a lot of value here in learning how did the Buddhist tradition interact with these different ideas, right? But so after our introduction, we have this large gathering of 16 meditation disciples and teachers, and they've gathered to ask the Buddha, as a spiritual teacher, advice on liberation. And so the Buddha here is not in the framework of someone who's kind of converting them or opposed to them, but they approach the Buddha with this extreme humility, this extreme sense of urgency, that they don't care who it is or what it is that's giving the teaching. They care about liberation. So they don't care if what they've practiced before was wrong. They just want to be free. And so that is also something that really shines through in the Parayanavagga, in this way to the beyond. Every single question, so all 16 disciples, when they ask their questions, you just feel this sense of urgency, like they're just eagerly listening with all of their attention, focused on what's being said, asking deep from within how they can achieve liberation, right? So that's really what comes through. So it's extremely deep. This collection is extremely deep. It focuses very much on the goal of the path, very much on the profound topics. So it's not really beginner friendly, but it's really beautiful anyway. So if you find it a little bit daunting, I think that you'll at least find it inspiring. And so, is there anything else to say on the introduction here? I think it's probably best that we just jump in and kind of discuss some of the questions themselves. So, as I mentioned, there are 16 disciples, and the first one to ask the questions is named Ajita. So Ajita literally means the unconquered. So it's not exactly clear the story or the background of Ajita, but we just know he's one of the disciples of Bhavri, according to this story. And he's the one who starts off this whole dialogue. So as the questions progress, it's a kind of intimate discussion with the Buddha amongst these meditation disciples and their own gathering of disciples. And so Ajita is the very first. And so he kind of sets the tone. So his question kind of dips in and it sort of foreshadows things that are going to be discussed later on. But it's not super personal. It's not super kind of involved yet because he's just starting. He's just asking the Buddha the first question. And after him, all of his companions will start asking and following, building on the questions that have been asked and introducing new ideas. And so I will recite Ajita's questions and the Buddha's answers. I'll go piece by piece. So as I said, these are in the form of poetry. And my understanding is that the tradition says that these were recited spontaneously. So poems that were recited in the moment. So the closest modern example I can think of this is actually rap battles. So you know about rap battles, then you understand how people can compose poetry on the spot. It's actually not that difficult if you do it with practice. So this is kind of the ancient version of a rap battle between the Buddha and these meditation masters. So they're composing these poems, and as they do, they're discussing deep, profound spiritual topics. So I might jump around a little bit, but I'll just start with the first one because I think that's probably the best way to go. So Ajita, after traveling this long way, he approaches the Buddha and he asks him, Kenassu nivoto loko, kenassu nampakasati, kisabhilepanang brusi, king sutassamaham bhayang. And the Buddha answers him, Avinjaya nivuto loko, pamādānampakāsati, jappābhilepanang brumi, dukkhamassamaham bhayang. So he says, by what is the world enveloped in shroud? Why does it not shine forth? Tell me, what is the world stuck and caught in? What is the world's greatest fear? And the Buddha says, the world is enveloped in the shroud of ignorance. It doesn't shine forth because of negligence. The trap the world is stuck in, I say, is prayer. Its greatest fear is suffering. And Ajita continues, Savanti sambadhi sota, sotanang king nivaranang, sotanang sangvarang bruhi, kena sota pithiyare. Yani sotani lokasming satite sang nivaranang, sotanang sangvarang brumi, panyayete pithiyare. That's the Buddha's answer as well. And so Ajita asks next, says, the streams are flowing everywhere. The streams are flowing everywhere. Okay, so we have this image of streams flowing. What is the block? What is the hindrance to the streams? Tell me the restraint of streams. And by what are the streams cut off? And so we'll discuss these in more detail. I just want to give you an initial taste here. And the Buddha answers, whatever streams there are in the world, mindfulness is their blocking. I call this the restraint of the streams. By wisdom they are cut off. And then Ajita continues, So this is his question as well as the Buddha's response. Panya cheva sati chapi namarupancha marisa etang me puttho pabruhi kathetang uparunjhati yametang panyang apuchi ajita tang vadhamite yathanamancha rupancha asesang uparunjhati vinyanasa nirodhena ethetang uparunjhati. So Ajita responds, he says, that wisdom and that mindfulness, sir, and name and form as well, tell me when I ask you, please, where do these cease? And the Buddha responds, the question that you've asked me, Ajita, I will declare the answer to you. Where it is that name and form without remainder cease. With the cessation of consciousness, these come to cease. And then Ajita asks one final question to the Buddha, which he responds. Ye cha sankhata dhamma se, ye cha sekha puthoidha, te sang me nipakoidyang puttho pabruhi marisa. Kame suna bhiginjheya, manasa na vilosya, kusalo sambadhammanang sato bhikkhu parimbhajeti. So Ajita says, those who have comprehended the teaching here and the various people in training, tell me their behavior, O astute one, when asked. For clearly, declare to me their behavior when asked, O astute one. And the Buddha answers, they would not be greedy for sensual pleasures. Their mind would be unclouded. They would be skillful in all things. That mendicant would wander mindfully. So it kind of ends on a very practical note. And so I hope you get a sense of how in Pali these are very beautiful, and my kind of impromptu renderings are not so beautiful, not so catchy. But I hope that the sense is relatively clear. And I know it went by quickly, so now we'll discuss this in a little bit more detail to give you a taste of it. So Ajita, he starts out by asking, by what is the world shrouded in? What is it enveloped in? What is it wrapped up in? Specifically, the word here is nivuto. Okay, so nivuto is related to the word nivarana, meaning what we sometimes call the 5 hindrances, right? The pancha nivarana. So Ajita, he asks the Buddha, the first thing he says, what is the hindrance? What is the shroud to the world? And nivuto has this sense of kind of wrapping up in darkness. So it's related to, we have this word Vaḍḍha. You might know the myth of Vaḍḍha, right? The cosmic serpent who wrapped the world up in his coils and blocked the waters. So this is an ancient myth from the Rig Veda, an ancient Indo-European myth. And so this cosmic snake wraps and constricts the world and covers it in darkness. And this is related to the word nivuto, so kind of shrouding and wrapping up the world. So Ajita asks, what is the world shrouded in, blinded by, constricted by? And the Buddha says it's shrouded by ignorance, avidya. And so this is already echoing one of the Buddha's teachings, right? The Buddha says, avidya nivarananang satanang tanha sangyojananang sandhavatang samsaratang. So, beings shrouded by ignorance and chained by craving, they roam and wander in samsara. So again and again they get reborn, again and again they live. And so the sense is that ignorance is like this darkness covering the world that's wrapped around it and blocking our vision, constricting us. And so we can relate to this, right? When we're meditating, the Buddha says that the world, what he calls the world, is the world of the senses. It's that with which we experience the world. Eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, mind. So our senses are wrapped up, covered in ignorance, in this dark veil, this shroud of unknowing, shroud of not understanding what's going on. And so he gives the Buddha this image of darkness, and then he says, why does it not shine forth? right? So why is it covered in darkness, and why does the light of the world not shine forth? Why does it not become clear and shine? And the Buddha says the world doesn't shine because of pamada, because of negligence, or because of heedlessness. So essentially, we're wrapped up in this dark veil of ignorance, confused, not knowing what's going on. Everything we experience, we're confused about it. We don't really understand, right? But we're negligent, so we don't apply our mind with diligence, with effort, with vigilance. And because of that, we don't shine. So we have this potential to shine. The world has this potential to become very clear, but it doesn't because we don't apply effort, because we're not heedful, right? So this is the kind of image that we can practice with. So each of these verses, it's something that in the tradition has been historically contemplated and given many different shades of meaning. And so already we can kind of apply this. One way that I have thought about this as I've kind of gone through and memorized these different questions and let them sink in is just, again, contemplating the senses, contemplating how everything we experience, it seems clear to us, but actually there's something wrong. There's something that we're not getting. That's why we're caught up in it, right? And so it can become clear through heedfulness. It can become clear through diligence in our practice. This starts with mindfulness, right? Right effort and right mindfulness. So applying mindfulness to what we experience and applying the antidotes and strategies and methods for purifying everything as it arises. So we experience something with our senses, immediately we need to be heedful. Otherwise, the darkness of ignorance will start closing in on us, right? So we have to apply this mindfulness constantly to shine forth through the veil of ignorance. And the next question that Ajita asks, he asks, what is the tar, or what is the sticky lime, sometimes it's translated, what is the trap or the snare that the world is caught in? And this word, it's actually used in other suttas for monkey traps. So in ancient India, apparently, maybe today, I'm not sure, people would put this kind of sticky little trap for monkeys, and monkeys would reach their hand in it and then get caught. And then they try to escape, so they put their hand in they try to pull their hand out, but when they put their other hand on the hand, now both hands are caught in the trap. So then they try to get their hands free, but then their other limbs get caught in the trap. So it's this kind of sticky snare, this sticky trap that the monkeys, they keep reaching and trying to escape, but every time they reach, they get caught. And it's very interesting. The Buddha says that the trap, this sticky trap that the world gets stuck in, right? So we want to be free, but we get stuck in what's called japa. So in modern, in Sanskrit, I believe this is jalpa. Maybe in people who speak Hindi or other Indian languages, they might recognize it. One translation of this is prayer. So the world gets stuck in prayer. And it's, well, what does that mean, right? So it has this sense of longing or praying for something, hoping for it, right? So we want to be free, so we pray for something. We pray for the future to be different, or we hope, oh, in the future it will change, or may someone save me from this. But see, we actually get caught in that, because it's not by hoping or wishing or praying or enchanting or longing. Actually, that process of longing and hoping is itself a form of craving, which gets us stuck even more. So just like the monkey tries to get free from this sticky trap, every time it reaches in to try to free its limbs, actually it gets more stuck. So we try to get free by longing and hoping, right? Let's say that we're experiencing grief. So we long and we hope for things to be different, or we wish it was otherwise, or we pray for something better. We hope for the future. But actually that process of hoping and longing and wishing for things to be different, we just get stuck in that. So every time we try to get free, by longing, we get stuck. And again, this is relevant on the just general worldly sense. So whenever we're going through something, are we trying to get free from it by hoping and longing and praying and wishing? And then we can contemplate, oh, I'm actually getting stuck even more. This is a trap. It seems like it's freeing, but it's actually a trap. And then also on the more subtle level of our meditation practice, right? Are we hoping for things to be different? Are we longing for things to be different? Every time we hope and we long and we wish and we pray and we think, oh, how could, maybe in the future it'll be better, or I hope it gets better. Yes, we need a certain level of motivation, but that process itself creates agitation, creates discontent. we become unsatisfied, so it stirs up the mind, and we get stuck in it instead of becoming peaceful, right? So the goal of our practice is to become peaceful, and we get stuck because we hope and long for things to be more peaceful than they are. So it's this kind of paradox here, and that's what the Buddha is saying. He's saying that the trap is actually hoping, it's praying, it's longing. And then the final question that Ajita asks the Buddha initially, he asks, what is the world's greatest fear? It's mahabbhayam. So bhaya means fear, but it also means danger. It has both meanings. So we're afraid of dangerous things. So in Pali, the word for fear and danger, they're actually the same. And so you could take it in either way, but the Buddha says that the greatest fear or the biggest danger is dukkha, right? So that's not too surprising. What's the problem? What's the big problem here? It's dukkha, it's suffering or pain. On the most basic level, dukkha just means pain. So one way this can be taken is in the context of the questions, right? So we're wrapped in ignorance, and if we're not heedful, then we don't get free from that. We can't get free from it. And so we get stuck by longing and hoping. What are we longing and hoping to be free from? What are we ignorant about? Dukkha, suffering, pain. So the real problem is the pain. It's not the story, right? So the story of our suffering. So maybe we think, oh, I'm suffering because I don't have XYZ, or I'm suffering because this person doesn't live up to my standards, or I'm suffering because they mistreated me, I'm suffering because of anything at all. The Buddha says that really the big fear, the really big problem, the danger here, it's not the story, it's the pain. It's just that suffering, that base level suffering that we all experience. That's universal, right? And so that is kind of pointing out in this very first exchange of questions. Like I said, Ajita, he sort of sets the stage. So already we're introduced to, okay, the problem is ignorance and longing and hoping because of suffering. And we need to apply heedfulness. So you can see here that already the Buddha has kind of introduced the Four Noble Truths, right? Dukkha is the problem. It's caused or it's made worse by longing and praying and hoping, like craving. The ending of that is caused through the path of heedfulness, path of practice. So we get a little taste of the Four Noble Truths, and this is just the first section. And then Ajita kind of switches here, and he asks about streams, right? So he says, these streams are flowing everywhere. What is the constraint, or what is the, I should say, hindrance to the streams? And so here, things are kind of switched around, right? So in the first question, Ajita asks, what is the hindrance to the world? And the Buddha said the hindrance is ignorance. But now he says, what is the hindrance to the streams? And the Buddha says that mindfulness is the hindrance. Right? So mindfulness isn't really a hindrance in the traditional way. So you can see the kind of play on words here, this exchange between these spiritual practitioners. Ignorance hinders us from seeing, but mindfulness is the hindrance to the defilements. So the streams here, they represent the flow, the flood, streaming from our senses of craving and aversion, hatred and desire, confusion, flowing everywhere. So everywhere we look, everything we hear, everything we smell, everything is just flowing with craving. It's flowing with confusion. It's flowing with hatred and aversion and resistance. Right? So this might remind us of the fire sermon. The Buddha says everything is burning. Our eyes are burning, our nose is burning. He says it's burning with greed, hatred, and delusion. So here we have kind of the opposite imagery, the imagery of water. So streams are just flowing everywhere, flowing with greed, hatred, and delusion. And mindfulness is how we can hinder those. It's how we can block those. And then the Buddha says that they're cut off. So we can kind of block a stream, but the water will still flow, right? Eventually, if we take our mindfulness away, the streams will flow. So Ajita asks, how do we actually cut off the stream? How do we actually stop it? Not just block it, but stop it. And the Buddha says that wisdom is how you cut it off. So what is the teaching here, right? our senses, the world, it's flowing with greed, hatred, and delusion. But if we apply mindfulness, then we can kind of block and slow down a little bit the flowing stream, the flood of defilement. And this is related to an image in the suttas of sense restraint. So in the passage on sense restraint, the Buddha says that if we don't restrain our senses, so if we don't guard, for example, the faculty of vision, so to give an example of this, let's say we're seeing something that we find very enticing and that makes us have a lot of desire. Let's say you see a food that you very much like, or you hear music that you really like. Well, if you don't apply mindfulness and kind of control that experience to not get wrapped up in it, if you don't let your mind, if you stop your mind from becoming obsessed in it, right? If we don't apply that mindfulness and that restraint to our senses, the Buddha says that unwholesome qualities will just flow and flood in. So these kind of like our mind is this city which is being flooded by water. And we need to block it with mindfulness. Otherwise, this water is just going to flood in and wipe everything away. So all throughout the day, our senses are flowing and flooding with information. And if we don't apply mindfulness at each of these doors, eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, mind, then we're going to be flooded with suffering, flooded with desire, flooded with discontent, flooded with anger and irritation, and flooded with confusion. So we have to apply mindfulness to kind of block this flow of constant defilement that will come in. But mindfulness alone is not enough, right? Mindfulness will only temporarily be a solution. It'll block the city, but the water will still be building up outside. So how do we actually get rid of the water? It's with wisdom. So with wisdom, that is seeing into the nature of sense experience, seeing into the nature of life, basically, seeing the, if one sees how things work on a deep level, then eventually it's possible for you to cross over that flood and kind of find safety, right? So it's nothing particularly new, but you can just sense, right, this sense of urgency already, this sense of we're wrapped in darkness and this floods are flowing, and he's just begging the Buddha. He says, "Tell me, sir, tell me, how do we cut these off? How do we stop them?" And the Buddha answers him. So it's this deep exchange, right? This very personal exchange. And then we get to the next section. So Ajita, he continues on. He builds on this question. So the Buddha just told him, okay, with mindfulness and wisdom, you can block the streams of defilements and you can eventually cut them off. But then Ajita, he asks something very interesting. He says, the mindfulness and the wisdom, and also name and form. So for sake of convenience, we could translate this as mind and body. So mindfulness and wisdom, and also our mind and our body, where does that cease? Right, which is very interesting. So I thought we think maybe wisdom is the goal of Buddhism, right? But Ajita, he asked the Buddha, but where does wisdom cease? So he's pushing, because one thing is to have wisdom, but he's looking to be free from the cycle of continued existence. He's looking to be free from samsara. So he's not looking to be wise. He's not just looking to have a pure mind. No, he's looking for freedom. So he's pushing beyond wisdom, beyond mindfulness, beyond the mind, beyond the body. He's asking the Buddha, where does all of that cease? Right? So this is where we start getting into kind of the deeper discussions, which will then reverberate and continue on. And so this is the kind of existential focus of the entire chapter. All of these students of Brahminical meditation, students of Brahmanism, of Bhaveri, they're looking for existential liberation. And the image that they give, that recurs again and again, is how to cross the flood to the far shore. So if any of you have ever lived in a flood zone, or if you've ever seen or been to a flood zone, you can maybe kind of get this image in the mind. So where the Buddha lived in the Ganges Valley, the Ganges would regularly flood. And also where the Brahmin Bhaveri was living, it says he was living on the banks of the Godavari River, also has extreme flooding. It's one of the worst rivers for flooding in India. So nowadays, with the state of the planet, we actually have a very good example of this, because the oceans are rising. So if you live on the coast, you just imagine everything is rising. The oceans are coming. There's no escape, right? Everything is warming up. The water is rising. Sickness and death are coming. There's no escape. And this is just extremely frightening. So if you live in a flood zone, then you know, but you can just contemplate. If we don't, for those of us who don't live in a flood zone, like Empty Colored Monastery is actually on a hill. Sometimes the basement gets a little bit of water, but it's not so bad. But our life, the image here is that our life is a flood zone. So at any moment, all of our loved ones could die. At any moment, we could lose all of our limbs. At any moment, the people we love might get horribly sick, or we might get horribly sick. There's no safety. You can't escape it. Medicine is a temporary measure, but there's no escape. So everything is just closing in on us with the dangerous peril of water, flood. And the only safety is to cross over to dry land, to far shore, away from the flood. But it can't be found in this world. It cannot be found in this life. It can't be found in another state of existence. It can only be found through escaping the cycle of samsara altogether. And so Ajita is pushing, and he's showing that to the Buddha by saying, okay, it's all good, mindfulness and wisdom, but where do those come to an end? How can I get past those too? And this is the kind of peak of the poem. So the Buddha responds with a longer answer, kind of showing that this is the sort of peak of everything. And the Buddha tells Ajita that it's with the cessation of awareness, it's with the cessation of consciousness that mind and body can come to cease. So if that seems a little bit mystifying, that's all right. I don't think we need to go into it too much right now. But the sense is that whatever we are aware of, as long as there's awareness of something, then we're going to be caught in the cycle of existence. So how do we get free from the body? How do we get free from the mind, all of which is impermanent and suffering and painful, including things like wisdom and mindfulness? They're good, but they're also impermanent. They're not reliable, and they're not the most peaceful. So the way to get beyond that is through the cessation of vijnana. And this is echoing one of the teachings that we see again and again, paticca samuppada, dependent origination. So in dependent origination, the Buddha says that mind and body depend on consciousness or awareness, and awareness depends on our mind and body. So one way of kind of relating to this is that in order to be aware of something, we need to have things to be aware of, and we need to have the sense faculties or the mental capacity to be aware. And so they kind of rely on each other. And so in order to get free of this bondage of being stuck in cyclic existence, awareness has to come to an end. And that means that the things that we're aware of in our body and our mental capacities, those also have to come to an end. So this is talking about final liberation. This is talking about sometimes called parinibbana. So when an enlightened being is the aggregates their remainder of their suffering, or the remainder of the dukkha that's arisen because of past craving, when it passes away. So that's what this is referring to. And then it ends with Ajita then, so after the Buddha has given them this answer, Ajita then asks, so all of the people who have comprehended the teaching and the various people who are in training, what is their behavior? So the Buddha kind of gives him this lofty existential liberation, the answer to his questions about that. But then Ajita kind of returns to the more practical topic. Okay, what is the method of training or the behavior of those people who have realized the teaching and those people who are still on the path? And the Buddha gives a very straightforward answer, so very applicable. Not be greedy for sensual pleasures. So all the different sensual pleasures we can experience, we need to remove greed for those. And he says they would have a mind that's unfoggy, unclouded. So a clear mind. We need to cultivate awareness. We need to cultivate clarity of awareness. We need to cultivate mindfulness and freedom from things like sleepiness or sloth and torpor, restlessness, agitation, anxiety, worry, all these things that cloud and fog the mind. The behavior of one in training would be to have an unclouded mind, clear mind. And then the Buddha says that they would be skillful in all things. So whenever presented with different mental states, we need to know what to do. We need to be very skillful, and we need to be reacting with wholesome behaviors, right? Reacting with wholesome mental states. So when anger arises, we need to know this is unwholesome, and we need to respond with a solution to skillfully work with that. If greed arises, we need to respond skillfully in a wholesome way. So everything that arises, every interaction, every mental state, we need to respond with skillfulness and wholesome activity. And then the Buddha very simply says that the monk would wander with mindfulness. So mindfulness is always good. So he kind of returns to that basic topic, being mindful, being skillful, not being greedy, and developing clarity of mind. So this is the kind of practice, the behavior of both those who have realized the Dhamma and those who are in training. And that's the end of the first question, the first discussion. And if you're interested in hearing the Buddha's explanation of this, there's a sutta in the Samyutta Nikaya, in the Nidana Samyutta, where the Buddha actually quotes this last verse. So the Buddha, he's speaking with his chief disciple in wisdom, Sariputta, and the Buddha says that in the questions of Ajita, in the way to the beyond, that this verse was recited. This is the Yecha Sankhata Dhammase, the final question of Ajita, asking about the behavior of those who are trainees and those who are arahants. And the Buddha says to Sariputta, explain the meaning of this brief statement in detail. So the Buddha quotes the verse, meaning that he knew it, and he quotes it to his disciple Sariputta, asking Sariputta to explain it. And Sariputta remains silent 3 times. So if you have a hard time understanding it, well, Sariputta, not that he had a hard time understanding it, but sometimes it can be difficult to explain and discuss these things. And so the Buddha gave him a hint. He said, Sariputta, do you see that this has come to be? And once he says that, Sariputta gives a whole explanation. So Sariputta immediately understands. And what Sariputta says, he says that those who have comprehended the teaching and the trainees, he divides these into 2 categories. He says the trainee is someone who sees what has come to be. So they see things that have originated. So basically they see our life has come to be, and they see that. And they practice for disenchantment, dispassion, and cessation regarding what has come to be. So they practice to give up the conditioned world. And he gives a kind of lengthy explanation of this, the Four Noble Truths essentially. And then he says that those who have realized the teaching, the arahants, they see what has come to be, and they see the nutriment or the origin of it, and they see that when the origin ceases, that what has come to be is liable to cease. They see that, and they've realized disenchantment, dispassion, and cessation in regards to it. So what seems like a very simple verse, just asking about the behavior of people, Sariputta actually gives a very detailed explanation in terms of dependent origination. So a very detailed, deep topic. So this is kind of giving you the sense of what I was saying earlier, that although the questions are very concise, ever since the time of the Buddha, they have been interpreted and discussed with extreme detail and kind of creativity by the disciples. So it doesn't seem obvious that this is talking about, for example, dependent origination and in the distinction between trainees and arhants and on this level. But when Sariputta gives a Dhamma talk on this poem, he talks about it in that way. And so you can kind of take that as an invitation to contemplate the poems, not just take them on face value, but really contemplate them. Like, what is each word? How can it be applied? How can it be thought about and applied in a kind of creative way? Now, we need to be careful, obviously, not to go too far, because there is a specific meaning, so we don't want to interpret it incorrectly. But we can also have a little bit of creativity, kind of applying it in a more practical way. And so that's something that's been done since the time of the Buddha. And if you're interested, you can find that discourse. So that's in the Samyutta Nikaya, number 31. You can find an explanation, the Dhamma talk from Venerable Sariputta, as well as the Buddha on this particular poem, or one particular part of it. So that's the questions of Ajita. And I know that this is a lot of information, but I hope that it's at least inspires you to read the collection on your own and kind of contemplate it on your own, because there's a lot of value there. So that's the first one. And I think maybe we can go over just one more, which is a bit shorter. I wonder which would be best. Some of them are more well known than others. But I think it might be interesting to go over the last one. So we've gone over the first question, and then you have the last question. So as the poems build, each person has a particular, you can kind of pick up on their character traits, their personality. And that's something that, again, is actually a little bit rare in the suttas. Sometimes you can get the personality of the people, but you start to get a sense of each person. And so after Ajita, they continue asking questions, and they build up until the very last person. His name is Pingya. And Pingya is old. His name is a little bit funny. It actually means, it's something like discolored skin, or kind of like blotchy skin. So maybe he was kind of old and had some blotchy, discolored skin, or tawny skin. Is sometimes tawny is sometimes the translation of it, but the word seems to have more a sense of actually like a discoloration, or like something. It's used for like stained yellow teeth, for example. So Pingya, his name actually kind of implies that he's old. And Pingya is very special because he's the last person to ask the questions after everyone has gone. And his questions are very, very personal and very vulnerable. So you really get a sense of him as well. So I'll recite his and the Buddha's answers, and then we'll discuss those, and then we can open it up. So Pingya says, Jinno hamasmi abalo vitavanno netana suddha savanang napasu mahang nasang moho antarav achikha dhammang yamahang vijanyang jati jaraya ida vimpahanang disvana rupesu vihanyamane rupanti rupesu janapamata tasmatuvang pingya appamato jahassurupang apunam bhavaya. So Pingya says, literally he says, I'm old, I am weak, and my complexion is fading. So he says, I'm old, I'm weak, my complexion is fading, my vision is poor, and my hearing is uncomfortable. He says, don't let me perish while still confused. Don't let me die while still deluded. Teach me the Dhamma so that I may understand the giving up of rebirth and old age here. So he's suffering, right? He tells the Buddha directly, he says, I'm old, I'm weak, my eyesight is bad, my hearing is bad. Please don't let me die while I'm still deluded. Please teach me the Dhamma so that I can understand how to give up rebirth. Please teach me so I can understand how to give up old age, aging. And the Buddha says to him, seeing how people are harmed and afflicted by physical forms, seeing how negligent people are afflicted because of forms. Therefore, Pingya, being diligent, abandon form to give up rebirth. Abandon form to give up continued existence. So very simple. So the Buddha, though, see how he relates to Pingya. So Pingya is telling him how he's old and he's suffering and he doesn't want to die while he's still confused. He wants to give up rebirth. He doesn't want to get reborn again. And the Buddha tells him, contemplate the suffering of having a body. Look at other people. So don't focus on, we don't want to get caught up in aversion and, again, this sense of longing and praying, but instead, the Buddha says, contemplate how people get afflicted by and hurt by and the different physical forms in the world. And he says, seeing that diligently, or therefore, Pingya, diligently, abandon form. So this is the classic teaching that the Buddha gives in his very first sermon, his very first teaching. He says that suffering is to be understood and craving is to be abandoned. So he's telling Pingya, okay, you're suffering from this body, you're suffering. If you understand that suffering, if you contemplate the suffering that's involved in having a body, then you can give it up and not be reborn. So contemplate it. So if we're going through something, we need to contemplate that situation, not getting mired and just sense of just deep confusion and agony, but contemplating it. So if we're very old and our eyes are not working, maybe some of us, my eyesight's not so good, but maybe some of you have it worse. Pingya here is suffering, and the Buddha tells him, you can use this as fuel for your practice, right? One of the ways this is said is that sometimes the most difficult things actually give rise to the beautiful practice, right? So this is the classic image of the lotus grows out of the mud, right? So mud it's dirty, but a beautiful lotus has to go through the mud in order to be born. It has to go through the mud to arise, right? So in the same way, Pingya is really suffering because of old age, but the Buddha says, well, it's because of contemplating old age that you can actually find freedom. So it's not in spite of the obstacles that we practice. The obstacles are the practice, right? So we think, oh, my mind is filled with hindrances, so I can't meditate. Meditation is the process of giving up the hindrances. It's not in spite of them. So it's the same way. So we think, oh, I'm suffering because of old age, I can't practice, or oh, I have so much suffering in my life. The suffering in your life is the practice. If you understood it, you'd be free of it, right? So that's the point. So the Buddha is kind of redirecting him to focus on understanding it. And Pingya then he asks one more question, and then the Buddha responds. And so this also is interesting. Pingya then says, Disa tasso vidisa tasso udhang adhodassa disai mayo atoihang adithang asutamutang va avinyatang kinchana mathiloke achikha dhammang yamahang vijanyang jati jaraya ida vipahanang. Buddha responds to him, Tanhadhipanne manoje pekhamano santapajate jarasa parete tasmato ang pingya appamatto jahassu tanhang apunambhavayati. So Pingya, you kind of get a sense of, he's a little bit of a slow learner. So he asks the Buddha, he says, I'm sorry, I actually recited the verse wrong. It's just Disa Chitasso. So I'm sorry. I was actually, I misrecited the number there. Disa Chitasso. But anyway, so Pingya says the 4 directions and the 4 intermediate directions, above and below, all these 10 directions, there's nothing that nothing that the Buddha has not seen, heard, thought, or cognized in the world at all. Please declare to me the Dhamma so that I might understand the giving up of rebirth and old age. So Pingya, he asks the exact same question again. He says, please declare to me the Dhamma so that I might understand how to give up rebirth and old age. So the Buddha has given him this answer, but he has this sense of deep faith, right? He starts out by just praising the Buddha. He says, in all the 10 directions, there's nothing that you haven't understood. Please teach me. So he just wants the Buddha to give him another teaching, just reaffirming that. And the Buddha says essentially the same thing, but with a slightly different angle. So now he says, contemplating people who are mired in craving with anguish and overwhelmed by old age. Therefore, Pingya, being diligent, give up craving to give up rebirth. So he just does the same thing. So just as he told Pingya to contemplate form and the suffering of the body in order to give up the body, now he tells Pingya to contemplate craving and how people are caught up and overwhelmed by aging and craving and suffering, essentially, anguish, and to give up craving. So he tells him something similar, but a little bit different. So here again, Pingya, he has this deep faith, this deep trust, just wanting the Buddha to tell him the answer, wanting the Buddha to guide him. And after the answers are over, there's another poem where Pingya, he's not asking the Buddha questions, but he's just praising the Buddha. And he says that he will continue reciting the Parayanavagga. He will continue keeping this tradition and reciting it. It's very beautiful. We don't have time to go through it right now. But he says that even though he lives far away from the Buddha, he constantly is in homage to him. He sees him in his mind, and he's constantly bowing to him, so he feels as if he lives with the Buddha. And he says that the Buddha, vast, deep wisdom, taught him the Dhamma. And so he has this deep sense of reverence for the Buddha. There's a kind of eulogy, a poem at the end, attributed to Pingya, where he's just discussing his deep, deep faith in the Buddha. One of the things he says there, to kind of close this off, He says, Ye me pumbe yakangso hurango tamasasana ichasiti bhavisati sabbantang iti hitihang. So he says, all those who answered me before I heard Gautama's teaching, that's the Buddha, all of those who answered me before I heard the teaching of Gautama, all they said was, so it was, so it will be. All of that was just so talk. So Pingya, remember, he was an accomplished meditation master. He was an accomplished spiritual teacher with many disciples. He was old. And what does he say? He says, everything he heard before, it was just so talk. It's just, this is how it was, this is how it will be, until he heard the Buddha's teaching. So he's just has this deep faith in the Buddha. And he's pointing to the directness, right? So what does the Buddha tell him? He doesn't say to perform a ritual to get over suffering. No, he tells him to contemplate suffering and to understand it, to give up his craving, right? So it's very practical. It's very, very practical. It's very direct. And constantly this recurs again and again in the collection. So it kind of closes with this long eulogy from Pingya, just praising the Buddha, expounding his faith, and talking about how he's determined to achieve awakening. And so with that, I think we can go ahead and close. And if there's any questions on what I've said or any other questions on the collection, we can discuss those now. So we can pay respects to this sharing from the Buddha, this Parayanavagga with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Okay. Hopefully that wasn't too much. I know that was a lot. It's hard also when you're listening sometimes, but you get a taste of the oral tradition. Okay, so we have some other people joining in. John says, very kind remark here. Thank you, John. It inspires you to learn the chanting. I very much recommend it. So, yeah, these are not so difficult to learn, not so difficult to memorize. And they're very, like I said, repeating myself over and over again, they're extremely beautiful and also extremely profound, actually. So you have that kind of extra motivation that you're following the footsteps of the Buddha and his disciples all the way to the modern day. And John asks, pray to whom are we praying? Or is it more hope which is in supplication? Yeah, so actually the sense here is that praying and longing and this sense of supplication, so asking of things from deities or other beings, actually the teaching from the Buddha is that that's a trap. So it's not by asking, but the Buddha says many times elsewhere that there is no liberation from another. So we cannot be liberated from someone else. So praying and hoping and longing for things to be different than how they are, it's actually just a form of craving, and that itself is the cause of our suffering. So craving, longing is where it's where the problem comes from. So the Buddha is actually not encouraging us to practice supplication or longing. He's instead saying not to get stuck in that trap, despite the fact that it seems very attractive, right? It seems very attractive because we don't want to suffer, but in fact it's a trap. Just like the monkey doesn't want to get stuck, so it tries to free itself, but because the trap is sticky, it gets caught every time. So prayer, supplication, longing, hoping, it has this sense. It seems like it's liberating, but it's actually a trap. This isn't to be confused, though. Sometimes I've noticed that people from Buddhist cultures, they sometimes use the word pray for chanting, because I think just obviously when speaking English, there's a kind of cultural transition that needs to happen. So sometimes Buddhist people will say pray when they're doing like chanting or something. And the Buddha's not talking about chanting. He's talking about, it could be chanting, but he's talking about specifically hoping and longing for something by essentially asking for it, supplicating, and kind of wishing for it. So that's what he's pointing to. It's not the act of reciting, but it's the mental state of hoping and longing. And John says, reminded of Nanda's mother. She used to recite verses from this section. Yes, exactly. Yep. Nanda Mata, very beautiful sutta. And Bhumika asks a practical question. Says, what is the best time to attend Saturday Dhamma teaching in the monastery? Well, Saturday at 6 o'clock in the evening, we have the meditation and Dhamma talk. But if you'd like to arrive at 5, there's also more informal discussion. So it kind of depends on you. If you arrive at 5, then there's more, less people are usually there, and so more time to ask questions in a more free-form way. But if you just want to be there for the formal program, then a little bit before 6 is best. John says, do you feel that chanting this section or even hearing it would automatically produce merit? Well, elsewhere in the Parayanavagga, the Buddha actually says that a sage or purity is not to be found through what is seen, heard, or thought, or also our various religious practices. So hearing or chanting itself doesn't produce merit. So even though this is a common idea, it was common in the time of the Buddha and it continues to be common. The Buddha was actually very clear. So he says that not through what is seen or heard or so on does one find purity. So since we're on the topic of the Parayanavagga, we might as well at least mention that here. So Nanda actually asks him, all the different ascetics, they say that you can become pure by seeing things. So for example, by seeing a holy image, seeing a holy person, that you can find purity. And they say that. They say that you can become pure from hearing things, like hearing, learning, for example, or hearing chanting. So this kind of idea. So he says, Ye kechi samana brahmana se dithassutena vadanti suddhing silambhatena vadanti suddhing anekarupena vadanti suddhing kachissute yattatha yata charanta atarung jatincha charancha marisa puchamitang bhagava bruhimetang. So that's what Nanda asks the Buddha. So those who declare purity through what is seen or heard or religious practices and habits or the various different means of purity, those people being diligent in practicing that, do they cross over rebirth and old age? Please tell me that. And the Buddha says, Ye kechi me samana brahmana se dithassutena vadanti suddhing silambhatena vadanti suddhing anekarupena vadanti suddhing kinchapi te tatha yata charanti nataring sujati charanti brahmi. So the Buddha says, all those different ascetics and Brahmins who say that there's purity through what's seen or heard, or the different religious practices or the various forms in the world, says even if their practice dedicated to that, they don't cross over rebirth and old age. Right? So just because we see something, that doesn't make us pure. And it's even worse if we think that we're superior to other people, because then we have a sense of pride, and that actually makes us less pure. So, but what I would say is that merit is produced if you contemplate the meaning and you find understanding, inspiration, and you practice because of it. So that is something that the Buddha does encourage. So he definitely encouraged learning the teachings, memorizing them, reciting them, thinking about them, and practicing according to them. So that is definitely encouraged. So chanting it, if you understand it, and if you reflect on it, or if you hear it and you reflect on the meaning, that is merit. So one of the highest blessings is hearing the Dhamma and discussing the Dhamma. So that's one of the highest blessings in the world. That's a teaching of the Buddha. So yes, chanting it and hearing it would produce merit if you understand it. Even if you don't understand it, you could still get merit if you chant it and then you practice because of inspiration. So if you find a lot of joy from chanting and then you practice and you try to purify your mind because of that, well, you don't get merit from the meaning, but you get merit from that dedication to the path. So also, even if you don't understand the chanting, it's actually still a good practice. But you just don't want to think that, oh, just because I sit down and do chanting, therefore I'm producing merit. That itself is actually a wrong view. But if you use it as a practice in order to cultivate the heart, then the cultivation is the merit, not the chanting. But it can be a kind of spur to that. And Karuna asks a question, which was then answered. So why would you dwell apart from him after Pingya speaks? Yes. Yeah, so it's attributed traditionally to Bhavati. So even though it's not actually said in the collection, in the text itself, it seems reasonable to think that was Bhavati, probably, or maybe another Brahmin, but probably Bhavati, and that's what the commentary says. So it said that after the Brahmins received the answers from the Buddha, then remember that Bhavati wasn't there. So they had to go back and talk to him about this. And so presumably in the kind of narrative, it's Pingya is reporting what had happened, and then he's reciting this to Bhavati. And one thing that's also worth pointing out about that is Bhavati was his teacher, but notice that Bhavati doesn't say like, oh, you should be following me, not the Buddha. Bhavati actually says, why don't you live with him if he's so great? And it, not in a sarcastic way, it doesn't seem. He's kind of saying like, Gautama, he taught you the Dhamma. The Buddha taught you the Dhamma. Why aren't you with him? And Pingya essentially says it's very difficult for him to travel, but he, in his mind, in his heart, he's with him. So it's very beautiful that Bhavati also has that sense of humility and that sense of appreciation for the truth. Yeah. And John says, will you come back next week to discuss the other parts? I don't know. Can't guarantee that. It's not certain. But if I do talk, I can talk more on the questions here. And we can maybe do a deep dive on just one of them to kind of go into it in a little bit more detail. So, yeah. Okay, was there anything from the audience here before we close? Yes, Dana?
So I have a couple of things that came to mind. So like I understand that there's like ways to deal with obviously different mental states. So what are some ways to deal with like fear, anxiety, or...
Well, I would say that goes a little bit beyond the scope of, it's a good question, but it's a little bit beyond the scope of this, because we also don't have a ton of time. But what I would say, if we're just sticking to what I talked about, is you can go beyond fear by understanding the situation, right? So applying your mindfulness to not get caught in the irritation or resistance, right? That was one of the teachings that was offered. And then to try to find a way to apply wisdom. So just like Pingya, he was suffering because of his old age. He's very fearful. He doesn't want to die while he's still confused. And he's in a lot of pain. So the Buddha tells him, you should contemplate that. Right? So not getting wrapped up in the fear, but instead using our wisdom, using any wisdom that you've developed, applying it to that, to try to understand it. Right? Because fear comes from we don't understand. It's kind of like, why are we afraid of the dark? Because we don't know what's there. So fear is like this, we don't get it, so we're afraid. And so if we can apply our investigation to that, not getting wrapped up in the defilements, then that's one way of approaching it, which is kind of relevant to what I spoke about here. But otherwise, I would bring it up to a tea time or monk chat or another, Dhamma talk. Yeah.
Okay. And then I do have one more question. It's like really more related to this. So, like, I remember, like, when I first kind of started studying Buddhism, they like would ask the questions about like praying and things like that. Like, I didn't really believe in that stuff. And I feel like now in practice, I mean, like, I do kind of like, share my daily life, like, if I need help, then I'll ask for help. But like also make sure I'm doing my other things in the practice too, like cultivate my mind. So what are your words on that? But I'm not gonna lie, I notice I have been a little bit more heavier and like just like wanting.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, so the problem isn't asking for help, right? Like if we're in a difficult scenario, we can ask for help. That's not necessarily coming under what the Buddha is talking about here. But more the problem, again, it's a mind state. So always in Buddhism, again, what does the Buddha say about our actions? He says that it's the intention that matters, right? It's not the physical part so much as the intention and how the intention affects the physical part. So if you are asking for help, well, what is in the mind? Is the mind overcome by hoping and longing and, please save me? Or is it just a practical thing, right? Like, let's say that the Buddha needs directions to get from one town to another. Well, he's not necessarily craving because of that, right? He's just asking for directions. So in the same way, you can actually apply it to asking for help from other beings. Like you might ask for help, but why are you asking for help? Are you hoping that they're going to save you? Are you longing for things to be different? In that case, then yes, on the higher level, then that would actually be, you would need to get over, you would need to transcend that on a higher level. Now, obviously, the Buddha here is speaking to advanced spiritual practitioners who were incredibly advanced. So if you're not there yet, that's okay. We don't need to try to be somewhere where we're not. We can't jump the ladder. We have to go step by step up the ladder. So if you find it helpful for your practice, then that's okay. But it is good to understand that that's only a step. It's not actually, you don't want to settle for that, right?
Right, yeah, I know.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I would say that the Buddha's answer would basically be, what is your mind state? Are you asking for help because you feel overwhelmed and you can't handle it? In that case, the best thing to do, the ideal thing to do, would be to cultivate your mind so that you don't need to ask for help. At least you don't need to be saved from it, right? But if it's a practical thing or you find it helpful as a step along the way, then it's okay. It's okay for the time being, but it's not to be settled for.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And does that go along with like offerings to be made too? Like that?
Well, offerings are a little bit different because if you're offering to make merit, then it's different from like longing and hoping and praying if it's taken in the right way. So like making an offering, making merit is something that we should be doing, right? We should be trying to make merit, at least with an attitude, the proper attitude. Is it true that technically just making merit to like have a good rebirth, is it true that that's not sufficient? Yeah, that's true. It is actually true that merit doesn't get us out of samsara. On a higher level, that's true. But a lot of people, they don't need to focus on that so much. They need to focus on making merit. But it is true that, yeah, in the Buddhist teachings, eventually merit does need to be let go of. Like eventually one needs to let go of trying to procure favorable situations for oneself. So like making offerings in order to have a good life. Eventually that needs to be let go of. But that's not really a priority. The priority should more be, how can I make merit in order to uplift the mind and so on. And then once you're ready, then you can start moving on. But if you stop making offerings now, like if you stop making merit, then you won't actually be transcending it. You'll just be not making merit anymore. You see what I mean? So the person who stops making merit, they do it when they transcend it. But if you're not ready to transcend it, then you need to make merit. Otherwise, you're going to be doing something else, which would be bad karma. So there's really no escape.
So transcending, does that mean like letting go?
Transcending merit means like someone who is free from all rebirth, basically. So they don't have either a heavenly rebirth or a bad rebirth. So eventually, my point is that eventually arahants abandon merit. But if you're not there yet, then you really just need to focus on building building the foundation. So I wouldn't really worry about offerings. More the problem is just looking at your mind state. Like, how can I be more content and more investigative instead of hoping for the future? That's more the problem. Like, we need to find the solution now. We shouldn't be hoping for something else to come and kind of intervene for us. But it's a gradual process. It's a gradual path. So don't be too having too high expectations for yourself.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll close up. Karuna did have one question here. If you come back next week, can we discuss if this authenticates the 32 marks? Yeah, I mean, we could discuss that. It's not one of the questions per se, but I guess it could come up. I mean, I would say that the 32 marks are in many suttas. It's not really just here. So, the 32 marks are found in many places. So, not too sure. Maybe if you have a specific kind of question about it, Karuna, then we could, if I do come back at some point about this, we could talk about that. Okay, so we will close up. It's been a while. So we can just close with 3 more sadhus to respect the Buddha's teachings. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And have a good night and a good practice. And we'll see you sometime in the future.